Ladies and gentlemen, this is Scott Pollock, Chief Editor of the Critical Post Chicago, reporting. Welcome to another edition of the Goldwater Report. Thanks again, ladies and gentlemen, for tuning us in. We appreciate it. If you can remember every once in a while to go to the head page of the Critical Post Chicago and click on an ad to support us, we'd appreciate that as well. Google will pay us. We've got a new episode of the Bittersweet Records Radio Hour you might want to check out on the head page. There's some great music in there, along with our usual sarcasm about the national and world events in between the tunes. As you know, ladies and gentlemen, this anchor doesn't come on the air to report about a bunch of fluff. If it doesn't make it into our broadcast channel, it's not worth anyone's time, except, of course, unless all of you are looking for entertainment in the journalism channels, because that's all it is, entertainment. It's nothing that matters. Ladies and gentlemen, this edition of the Goldwater Report is part opinion, also part fact, that focuses on the Panama Papers and what this could possibly mean to the general public. Now, they're a little bit out of view. It's been a month since that story broke, and now all of a sudden we're on to a whole mess of other stuff. The Panama Papers are old news to some people, or to most people, especially in the journalism propaganda press. It's time to move along. There's nothing important here. But before we get into the opinion, I want you to take a look at a numerical valuation graphic. Now, let me change the screen here so you can see it. Ladies and gentlemen, what you see here is a number that starts with 2,178 with a dollar sign in front of it, and followed by 51 zeros, or 17 sets of 3 zeros each. A trillion, as you see below, is 12 zeros. Can anyone who's watching this give me a name for the top number? Of course, no, you can't. Let me change the screen back. Now, the only thing you could say is that it is 2,178 times 10 to the 51st power. Now, we're going to return to that in just a bit. Ladies and gentlemen, a nation's people can't understand its politics, its politicians, and the issues with political malfunction unless it has a rudimentary understanding of economics and, more importantly, money, which is also thereby translated into power and the corruption of that power. Power, as understood here, means overwhelming and in some cases unwieldy political influence to cause that power to default into murder, avarice, and unbridled greed, with an emphasis on the adjective unbridled. Murder, as in the means for governments to perform war operations. So when reading through the day's annals of journalism channels available, we must understand that journalists themselves, every single one that you witness in just about every case, are corrupted by their lack of knowledge in these areas. Therefore, the integrity of the information from these places is most assuredly compromised and can't be relied upon. There's too much conjecture and not enough substance with a formal understanding from where they speak. They're entertainers reciting a script, not news reporters. Now that applies to the fear pornography alternative press as well as the major media corporate conglomerate propaganda press, which are also socialists. There's a perception these days that overwhelming amounts of money is bad, and that folks who have these resources and who have acquired them by various means are an outright evil and must be dealt with. This is Marxist claptrap, ladies and gentlemen. The problem becomes, whom shall be entrusted with power to bring illegal behavior to justice when the institutions of government themselves as a whole come under suspicion as to render them absolutely untrustworthy by the populations at large, including here in America and over in the UK. The facts are, the public has no effective action to stop the abuse of power within the governments themselves, and everybody knows it. They then throw their proverbial hands in the air as if to say, what's the use of this authority, and thereby its ability to tax us with the purpose in mind to uphold, quote unquote, the law. Now let's look at this a bit more closely. Our audience is quite aware of the bias of this anchor desk, namely, that there are several factors which help to clarify the issues surrounding what money is and the use of money, private property, and who owns what private property. That's our bias. Now, one, what money is. It's merely a means, obviously, of international and recognized nationally legal exchange for goods and services. On the surface, it would seem that's an obvious fact, but when we look at it more in depth at the object, because of the bad information that's out there, it's not so clear-cut. One of the most important interviews we've conducted is our interview and discussion with Mr. Bill Still, another interview with Harmon L. Taylor, and yet another interview with the frontman and author of the White Hats reports. We don't just perform interviews for the sake of entertainment. They had a purpose. We wanted to get to what the heck is our status. What's going on here? In these discussions, the understanding of the concept of money was the focus. In the case of Mr. Still, we dispelled the idea that money is a storage of value. Clearly, that's incorrect because money valuations internationally change daily on the Forex market due to speculation and economic forecasts. That's the simple explanation. In the case of Mr. Taylor, the idea of honest weights and measures, which is America's constitutional definition of money, or alleged constitutional definition of money, has been abandoned for Federal Reserve notes instead of money being defined as a certain amount of grains of silver. As well, in Mr. Taylor's litigations career, we've learned that, in fact, we do have the right to not enter into a commercial agreement vis-a-vis by the federal system. In other words, what we choose as money has everything to do whether we have control of our destiny, and that has nothing to do with a political reality. The gotcha term applicable here is the term federal. Federal, as applied, means by agreement. We have a right not to enter into that agreement. Focusing back on Mr. Still's research, what has been done to the American public with the printing and the use of quote-unquote Federal Reserve notes has been to deprive them of A, their common law identities because of entering into a commercial contract without the understanding and nature and the terms of what that commercial contract activity outside of any alleged constitution is, as well depriving them of purchasing power through something called a flexible money supply, debt, as a storage of value. Another gotcha. And finally, inflation. 2. Over many hours of discussions on several occasions with one of our advisors, the author and publisher of the White Hats Report, a forensic auditor who understands the sleight of hand being practiced by the nation's accountants using confusing terminology designed to obfuscate what's going on in the balance sheets of the nation's government corporations, their comprehensive annual financial reports, and in the case of the federal government, the consolidated financial statements. One of the problems with the Federal Reserve System is there are no clear records available to the public as to how much money has been printed and is in circulation as a result of policies by the federal central banking districts, of which there are 10 or 12, as I recall. 3. Mr. Still's research finds that by the federal government's refusal to decouple from private bank money printing, which has as its core fundamental principles fractional reserve banking and debt note, quote-unquote, value storage, that the system only best serves those private banks printing the money and continues to inflate equity valuations in worldwide capital markets. This is being practiced by every single central banking cartel on the planet, and not just the Federal Reserve. They've all learned how to do it from the Federal Reserve, though. Also, that this paradigm is a bad use of the concept of money. Mr. Still further notes that were the federal government to return to printing sovereign notes, gradually replacing Federal Reserve notes, and using United States notes, which are debt-free legal tender unbound from fractional reserve banking practices, and debt as a storage of alleged value, that there would be less turmoil internally in America and a return to alleged constitutional monetary authority, which was abrogated by the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. And the accompanying Internal Revenue Service Act of 1913, passed later that year. 4. How the worldwide espionage state in every country, including our own, gathers and uses money to perform clandestine operations is also at issue. In every real sense, warfare by other means than bullets is being conducted on every piece of nation-state real estate on the planet. How these espionage operations are employed are by several dozens of methods, and as a result of the aforementioned factors and this, the world's populations roil over their abilities to find economic stability no matter where they live. Now, this is a simplified statement of the facts. The confusion in the general population's mind as a result of a largely successful propaganda war that's been waged for 100 years by economists bought and paid for in the American institutions of higher learning, our colleges and universities. And that is misinformed propaganda, and it cannot be overstated. Folks such as the New York Times columnist Paul Krugman should be regarded as useful fools and someone you should never, ever take seriously. Capitalism as a concept is also misunderstood. Without going into too much detail here, as noted in the seminal work by deceased author and professor at Georgetown University, Carol Quigley's book, Tragedy and Hope, in its original publishing, which remains out of print unabridged, the various periods and form of capitalism periods are discussed as theories of economics and how they've been used over the last 4 centuries. Most folks have never read the work and instead rely on, for their judgments, many misguided notions and bigotries or prejudices which cannot be delved into here. In short, it is the willful ignorance on the part of most folks in the lay population and their education institutions in every country that keeps people in the dark. Now, one could surmise there is a widespread conspiracy afoot about these matters, and that would point directly at the murky operations of banking and managed misperception. Is the public being systematically dumbed down to the point of incomprehensive of these important matters of understanding? Perhaps. And then again, perhaps not. But it can't be discussed here. The fear pornography journalism channels aren't helping either to educate the public. If anything, they're only exacerbating the problem. The facts can't be discounted. People don't understand economics or money. They haven't taken the time to educate themselves, and the schooling system of economics here in America and throughout much of the world has not made it a priority for folks to comprehend these subjects in their curriculums at every level of the education system. So, with all that as a backdrop, we turn to the Panama Papers. The Panama Papers was reported as a document leak containing 11 million pages of data, which uncovered various tax evasions and trust shelters by some political notables in various countries around the world. In the immediate aftermath, some folks stepped down from their posts as a result of their improprieties and embarrassments. The fear pornography channels, along with others who bemoan capitalism, socialism, at all, in a stream of confusing non sequitur rantings, claim the ICIJ, or the International Consortium for Investigative Journalism, is a CIA tool. GlobalResearch.ca, in an article by Timothy Alexander Guzman, cites they're an offshoot of the Center for Public Integrity, which is funded by the likes of George Soros and the Rockefellers, the Ford Foundation, and others. Ladies and gentlemen, when the world propaganda complex drops a shiny object like the Panama Papers in your lap so you can Google it, there's always a reason, and that is rarely to inform you about something important. The reporters who think they've got something of merit are either unwitting dupes or part of a larger operation. Was it the CIA, MI6, or any other espionage operation in the world? Does it matter? In the opinion of this anchor desk, no, it doesn't. Our problem is, folks, that there's as many espionage operations afloat as there are member nations in the malignant body in New York City called the United Nations. When you have that many operations in the field, and you know that part of their operations are to protect the value of their preferred central banking cartel currencies, you must be suspect as to why certain bits of exposed corruptions occur in the journalism channels at all. The preamble, ladies and gentlemen, to what is World War III is already being fought. It's a two-front war. One in the forex markets, and the other is on land for all of you to see. But it's your pocketbooks that are being attacked as nations and populations are being composted, or in other words, destroyed. Right now, all over Africa and the Middle East, populations are being wiped out, irrespective of creed and who's doing what to whom. In America, 25% of the population is in modern-day depression that no one actually sees because the breadline or soup kitchen comes in the form of a link card. However, if you stand in the checkout line at an Aldi food store on the north side of Chicago and watch how many people are using those link cards, you can get a general idea of how pervasive the shadow soup kitchen is. Which brings us to the opening of this broadcast. Ladies and gentlemen, the number you see on the screen has been verified by a consortium of forensic accountants and was shown to me last year during the Keenan investigation. It is the top trustee beneficiary's holdings that belongs to a specific trust. What I witnessed was the document trail that was the conveyance of a trust from one person to another front person, both of whom were Germans. We have the passports documented and the names of these folks. We don't have the money to chase them down, and we're not asking for it either. We don't care about chasing them down. The document, however, is real. Now, that's my considered opinion and estimation, and the amount of trust that I have for the individual who revealed it to me. There is no question in my mind, as a result of this person's work, that the document is real. Take a look at that number, ladies and gentlemen. Look at that top number. That is $2,178 times 10 to the 51st power. The amount of beneficiaries in this trust reveals a banking cartel that contains 394 member banks throughout the world that represent the names of every famous household banking name in the banking business everywhere in the world. They're all in there. The amounts attached to the names of all these banks has not been tabulated as of this date, but the final number would be more staggering than the amount you saw on the screen. What the amounts represent is the amount of the skim operation that has been taking place that is off the ledgers in a second set of books known by some as the black screen accounts, and we surmise, though we can't discern at the moment, This has been going on since the inception of the Federal Reserve. This money, whether skim or hypothecation or a combination of both, is enough money to either A, liquidate the entire debt of the world and all its peoples, or B, enough money to be used as a lever to keep the Western hegemony of the markets throughout the world in play for as long as these cartels want to play the game. It's that simple. The emerging markets are so levered up with United States dollar-denominated loans and debt, they cannot decouple from the ledgers without default and sending the whole world into a tailspin, which is why, as you see, the so-called crisis in Greece and other places has not gone anywhere or has been resolved by the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, or the European Union, or a combination of all of them together. So when you see and you hear about all the rest of the financial market hand-wringing or the fraud reports or the corruption reports or the money laundering reports being quote-unquote leaked to the unsuspecting public in the form of journalists who actually think they have a handle on things, return to this report, take a look at that number again, because $1 trillion to these folks is child's play. As far as the propaganda and fear pornography journalism channels are concerned, none of them dare bring this into the light of day. They're scared. If they knew about it, they'd be very scared. Because people still give them some credibility. So, were ABC News or NBC News or CBS News to actually have some integrity and bring that little item that you saw on the screen into the light of day, probably the next day they'd be blown to smithereens. As for this anchor desk, we simply don't care. But that number is real. That trust is real. However, the depravity and sheer madness of the folks in the worldwide Forex banking cartels is of such a malignancy that it cannot be ignored any longer. So pass this report on to somebody. What can you do about it? We're simply at a loss for words, except to ask the question again, have you got a couple of spare aircraft carriers with a full complement of stealth fighters and bombers and their ordnances? Now, that would be a start. Or you might want to ask, who in the current crop of America's political class, or the UK's political class, is going to have the guts to take on the Federal Reserve or the London Exchequer and return to Americans, or in other words, we the people, the power of the Treasury to print United States notes and begin unraveling the Federal Reserve fractional reserve debt note banking scam that has been with us for over 100 years. That would be another area to pressure. If neither of those two methods will be employed, you can continue to witness and experience a lot more of what you're already immersed in, which is a continued devaluation of your purchasing power and shadow soup kitchens here in America and around the world. and the ever perennial creep of worldwide fascism, socialism combinations. Again, this is Scott Pollack, Chief Editor of the Critical Post Chicago, reporting. Thanks again for watching another edition of the Goldwater Report. We'll be back later. That is all.